Close your eyes slowly. Take a deep breath in and exhale gently. Let your mind slowly drift away from the day's worries. At this moment, it's just you and a calm journey through time. Tonight, we travel to a civilization that was once considered the most powerful empire in the world, the Roman Empire. But the question remains, how did this great empire fall? Was it the hidden weaknesses, wars, and destruction that slowly tore it apart from within? Or was it the politics, economy, invasions, and final days that shook its foundations? Did Rome collapse suddenly? Or did it gradually walk the path from power to ruin? These are not just titles. They are the questions that history still asks us today. And in tonight's story, we will uncover all these answers. Slowly, calmly, allowing your mind to relax and drift towards sleep. But before we continue, a small request. If you are enjoying these stories, please subscribe to the channel. This way, you won't miss the upcoming videos, and it also encourages me to bring more engaging and relaxing stories for you. Also, do share your location in the comments. Globe showing Europe, Africa. I'd love to know from which part of the world you are listening to this story. And please let me know if you find these stories helpful for relaxation and sleep. So, let us begin our journey to Rome, where a great empire slowly hollowed out due to its internal crises. The foundations of the Roman Empire were strong for centuries. Yet over time, cracks began to appear, like fine fractures forming in a magnificent structure. From the outside, everything seemed grand, but inside, weaknesses were silently growing. The Senate, once the pride and backbone of Rome, became a hub of chaos and self-interest. Senators no longer fought for the people, but for their wealth, power, and prestige. Debates revolved around personal gain rather than the welfare of the state. The values of honor, sacrifice, and duty, once the pillars of Roman society, slowly faded, replaced by greed and selfishness. The emperors were no different. Some ruled wisely, but most were weak, cruel, or incompetent. The halls of power were filled with fear, intrigue, and betrayal. Many emperors were assassinated by their own guards or courtiers. With each new ruler, citizens' hopes rose and quickly fell. The greatest strength of Rome, stability, gradually eroded. This political weakness led the empire into civil wars. Generals, commanding loyal legions, turned their armies against each other in the quest for the throne. The Roman army, once created to defeat foreign enemies, now marched against its own city. Citizens watched helplessly as their protectors became their oppressors. Fear and despair settled deep in Rome's heart. Social division acted like a poison. The wealthy lived in grand villas and palaces, while the poor struggled in crowded streets and slums. The gap between rich and poor widened to a breaking point. Riots, uprisings, and unrest became common, further destabilizing the social structure. Moral values also declined. Roman citizens, once proud of discipline, hard work, and service, became indulgent in luxury and pleasure. Gladiatorial games and bread and circuses gave temporary delight but never addressed the real issues of the empire. It was like putting a bandage over a wound that continued to fester inside. Religious shifts added uncertainty. Traditional Roman gods and rituals gradually lost their prominence. The rise of Christianity offered hope to many but also created divisions. When unity was most needed, people were moving in different directions. The Roman army, once the backbone of power, was also weakened from within. Soldiers became loyal to their generals rather than to the empire. Many legions were made up of mercenaries who fought only for pay, not for the glory of Rome. Discipline declined, and the army lost its former might. All these factors combined hollowed out Rome from within. Each civil war drained resources. Each new emperor's incompetence eroded public trust. Each conspiracy weakened the empire's foundations further. Imagine a great tree. From the outside, it looks tall and green, but inside, termites are quietly eating it away. When the storm comes, the tree falls not because of the storm, but because it was hollow from within. The Roman Empire was much the same. Enemies were still at the gates, but the real collapse had already begun. Political chaos, social division, military weakness, and moral decline had left the empire vulnerable to any major shock. And that shock was soon to come when the Roman Empire faced one of the greatest economic crises in its history. As Rome's political and social structures weakened, the cracks soon spread into its economy. The empire, once thriving on trade, agriculture, and tribute, now faced challenges that strained every level of society. Economic instability became one of the most significant causes of Rome's decline. Heavy taxation weighed on ordinary citizens. Farmers, laborers, and merchants were burdened with ever-increasing taxes, often leaving them with barely enough to feed their families. The wealthy elite, in contrast, avoided many of these taxes through influence and privilege. This imbalance created resentment and widened the gap between rich and poor. Cities became crowded with people struggling to survive, while lavish villas and estates flaunted their luxury. Dependence on slave labor further weakened the economy. Slaves, who had once been the engine of Rome's productivity, became more expensive and harder to manage. As Rome expanded less aggressively, the supply of new slaves dwindled. Without sufficient labor, agricultural production fell, trade slowed, and urban centers suffered shortages of food and basic goods. Trade routes that once linked Rome to distant provinces started to falter. Piracy, political instability in border regions, and insecurity along the roads disrupted commerce. Markets became unreliable, prices rose, and scarcity led to inflation. Coins lost their value, and the trust in currency, a cornerstone of economic stability, began to erode. The army, Rome's lifeline, also drained resources. Maintaining legions across vast territories required enormous expenditure. When taxes and resources fell short, soldiers' pay was delayed or reduced. Loyal troops became restless, and some even turned against the empire, hiring themselves out as mercenaries or rebelling when promises were broken. The empire faced the impossible task of defending its borders while simultaneously struggling to fund its own survival. Agriculture, the backbone of Rome, suffered further from neglect and overuse. Fertile lands were overworked, irrigation systems fell into disrepair, and crop yields declined. Famines became more frequent, and scarcity of food led to unrest among the populace. Many farmers abandoned their lands, choosing instead to migrate to cities in search of work, further inflating urban populations and deepening social strain. Inflation became rampant. The Roman government, desperate for money, often minted more coins, reducing their silver content. This practice undermined confidence in currency and destabilized trade. Prices soared, and ordinary citizens found themselves unable to afford basic necessities. Wealthy elites often hoarded resources, making the situation worse for those who already struggled. The economy's collapse also affected infrastructure. Roads, aqueducts, and public buildings fell into disrepair. Maintenance became costly, and the state's focus shifted to short-term survival rather than long-term development. Public services deteriorated, and the quality of life for ordinary Romans declined sharply. Even provincial provinces, which had once contributed heavily to Rome's wealth, began to resist paying taxes or providing supplies. Local revolts erupted in regions like Gaul, Hispania, and North Africa, further draining the empire's resources. With internal unrest and a faltering economy, Rome struggled to maintain its dominance over distant territories. This economic instability exacerbated social unrest. The gap between rich and poor became almost unbearable. Riots, looting, and rebellion were frequent. Public faith in the empire's ability to govern effectively declined, and citizens felt abandoned by those in power. All these financial difficulties intertwined with the empire's earlier political problems. Corruption among tax collectors, officials, and governors made matters worse. Mismanagement of funds, extortion, and favoritism diverted resources away from essential public services and military needs. The empire was bleeding from both internal mismanagement and external pressures. Even culture and daily life were affected. Once prosperous marketplaces now faced shortages, artisans and tradesmen struggled to sell their goods, and entertainment became increasingly focused on cheap spectacles rather than civic engagement. Bread and circuses could only mask the deep economic wounds for so long. By this point, the empire's economy was a shadow of its former self. The combination of high taxes, reliance on slavery, failing agriculture, inflation, and trade disruptions created a situation where the Roman state could no longer sustain its military, social, or administrative obligations effectively. Imagine a giant ship caught in a storm. Its sails are tattered, its hull has cracks, and water seeps in from every direction. The crew struggles to keep it afloat, but every effort seems to make the situation worse. This was Rome's economy, an empire trying desperately to survive while its very foundations were crumbling. The economic collapse didn't happen overnight, but it set the stage for external invasions and internal revolts. The empire, already weakened by political corruption and social divides, could no longer maintain its borders or feed its people adequately. And so, as Rome's coffers emptied and its trade networks faltered, the empire became vulnerable to forces from outside, powerful barbarian tribes, rebellious provinces, and opportunistic generals ready to take advantage of Rome's weakened state. The story of Rome's economic crisis shows that even the most powerful empires can crumble when their financial foundations fail. Taxes, inflation, declining productivity, and mismanagement all contributed to a slow but inevitable decline. And as the economy faltered, the next stage of Rome's fall became unavoidable. The external invasions and pressures from barbarian tribes that would push the empire closer to its ultimate collapse. As Rome's internal weaknesses and economic crises deepened, the empire's borders became increasingly vulnerable. Neighboring tribes and barbarian groups, who had once been contained by strong Roman armies, began testing the empire's defenses. These invasions were not just battles of land, but assaults on the very stability and identity of Rome. Among the most formidable were the Goths, Vandals, Huns, and Franks. Each group had its own motive. Some sought land, others treasure, and some simply survival. The Roman legions, once feared throughout the known world, were now stretched thin, both physically and financially. Mercenary armies replaced disciplined citizen soldiers, and loyalty often lay with commanders rather than the empire itself. The Gothic invasion in the late 4th century was a turning point. After fleeing the Huns, the Visigoths sought refuge within Roman borders. But mismanagement and neglect by Roman officials led to tensions, sparking the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD. A catastrophic defeat for Rome. Thousands of soldiers perished, and the empire's aura of invincibility was shattered. The Vandals, moving through North Africa, disrupted crucial grain supplies. Rome, dependent on North African provinces for much of its food, faced scarcity. Starvation, unrest, and economic instability increased, feeding a vicious cycle of decline. Meanwhile, the Huns, under the fearsome Attila, advanced from the east. Their speed, ruthlessness, and unpredictability created panic in Roman territories. Even without prolonged occupation, the mere threat of Hun invasions forced Rome to divert enormous resources to defense, draining both treasury and morale. Frontier defenses, once fortified with precision, began to crumble. Walls, forts, and watchtowers fell into neglect as the empire struggled with internal corruption and financial shortages. Local garrisons, undermanned and underpaid, often failed to resist barbarian incursions. Many border settlements were abandoned, leaving wide stretches of land vulnerable. The psychological impact was as profound as the physical damage. Romans who had long believed in the eternal power of their empire now witnessed foreigners traversing their lands freely, looting, and sometimes settling permanently. This eroded public confidence and shook the collective sense of security. Internal revolts often coincided with external attacks. Provinces, frustrated by heavy taxation and neglect, sometimes welcomed barbarian forces or resisted Roman authority outright. The empire's cohesion, already fragile from political and economic strains, was further weakened by these simultaneous internal and external pressures. The sack of Rome in 410 AD by the Visigoths marked a symbolic low point. Although Rome was no longer the political capital of the entire empire, the psychological blow was enormous. Citizens realized that centuries of invincibility and dominance could be toppled. The city itself, once a symbol of unyielding power, now lay vulnerable to foreign hands. Meanwhile, the Vandals' conquest of Carthage in 439 AD deprived the empire of crucial economic and naval resources. Rome's control over the Mediterranean was increasingly challenged, reducing its ability to mobilize supplies and defend far-flung territories. Trade routes were disrupted, communication slowed, and local populations suffered both from scarcity and violence. Even the Eastern Roman Empire, later called Byzantium, was affected. While it survived longer, the Western Empire's collapse sent shockwaves that undermined Roman unity. The separation of East and West reflected the empire's inability to manage multiple fronts simultaneously, politically, militarily, and economically. Barbarian groups were not merely opportunists. They were often responding to pressures of their own. Population growth, migration, and the movement of other tribes, like the Huns, forced these groups into Roman lands. Yet Rome's weakened state meant it could no longer control entry, negotiate settlements effectively, or integrate these populations peacefully. The empire's military strategy, once its greatest strength, was failing. Reliance on foreign mercenaries created divided loyalties. Commanders often pursued personal ambition over the empire's survival. Without unity in leadership and discipline in the army, even small raids could turn catastrophic. By the late 5th century, the combined weight of internal corruption, economic collapse, and continuous barbarian invasions left Rome unable to sustain its authority. Cities fell, populations migrated, and civic structures crumbled. What had taken centuries to build was now being dismantled in a few generations. The psychological impact of constant invasions cannot be overstated. Citizens experienced fear, uncertainty, and a sense of inevitability. Rome, once synonymous with strength and civilization, now represented vulnerability and decline. The empire's myth of invincibility shattered, leaving behind a patchwork of territories, struggling leaders, and restless populations. External invasions also accelerated cultural changes. Barbarian settlements brought new customs, languages, and governance practices. Roman traditions mixed with those of newcomers, creating a slowly transformed landscape. While this cultural blending would eventually give rise to medieval Europe, it marked the end of Rome as it had once been. Imagine a fortress on a hill, once impregnable, now surrounded on all sides by relentless forces. Supplies are scarce, the walls are cracked, and defenders are exhausted. Rome, with all its history, glory, and power, stood in much the same way, resilient in appearance but vulnerable to collapse from every direction. And so, as barbarian tribes pressed inward and Roman defenses faltered, the empire edged closer to its ultimate fall. The stage was set for the final chapter, internal decay and the disintegration of centralized power that would permanently reshape Europe. External pressures were no longer temporary challenges. They were the catalysts that transformed centuries of decline into a tangible collapse. Rome's story, once defined by conquest and order, was now defined by survival against forces both outside and within. This chapter of invasions shows that even the mightiest empire is vulnerable when its internal systems fail and external pressures intensify. The lessons of Rome remind us that power without stability, wealth without fairness, and defense without loyalty are fragile foundations. And as the barbarians advanced, the next stage of Rome's final decline was inevitable. The disintegration of central authority, the fragmentation of territories, and the final moments of the Western Roman Empire. As the Roman Empire staggered under the weight of internal decay, economic crises, and relentless barbarian invasions, the inevitable end approached. The Western Roman Empire, once the jewel of civilization, now faced fragmentation and loss of authority. By the late 5th century, central control had weakened so much that governors, generals, and local leaders acted independently. Decisions that once required coordination across the empire were now made in isolation, often conflicting with one another. Communication was slow, supply lines were disrupted, and trust between the central government and distant provinces had eroded. Rome's cities, once bustling centers of culture, trade, and administration, now faced depopulation and decay. Wealthy citizens fled to safer regions, while common people struggled amidst scarcity, unrest, and uncertainty. Infrastructure crumbled, aqueducts failed, roads became impassable, and public buildings fell into disrepair. The physical signs of decline mirrored the empire's internal collapse. In 476 AD, a symbolic moment arrived. The last emperor of the Western Roman Empire, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain. Though the Eastern Empire continued for another 1,000 years, the Western Roman Empire had effectively ended. The political structure that had once dominated Europe for centuries had dissolved into smaller kingdoms ruled by barbarian leaders. Yet, the fall was not merely political. Rome's cultural identity, sense of security, and shared purpose had been eroded over centuries. Citizens had witnessed generations of corruption, economic hardship, and invasions. The myth of Rome's eternal power was gone, replaced by uncertainty and adaptation. Even in its collapse, Rome's influence persisted. The legal systems, architectural knowledge, and cultural practices of Rome continued to shape emerging European civilizations. Roads built by Roman engineers, aqueducts, and amphitheaters remained, a silent testament to the empire's enduring legacy. But for the citizens of the final Western Empire, life was a mixture of fear and adaptation. Many communities now depended on local strongmen for protection, rather than a distant emperor. Alliances shifted constantly, and survival became the priority over grandeur or glory. The empire's collapse highlighted that no matter how vast and powerful a civilization may appear, internal weakness and external pressure can lead to sudden transformation. Despite the chaos, life carried on. People adapted to new rulers, rebuilt local economies, and preserved fragments of Roman culture. Christianity, once a persecuted faith, became a stabilizing force in many regions, guiding morality, education, and community life. While political structures crumbled, social and cultural threads continued to weave continuity across generations. The fall of Rome also brought lessons for the future. It demonstrated that unchecked corruption, inequality, overextension, and failure to adapt can undermine even the greatest powers. Leaders, citizens, and societies must balance ambition with responsibility, strength with ethics, and conquest with care for the people they govern. As the empire disintegrated, barbarian kingdoms established themselves across former Roman territories. These new powers would eventually evolve into medieval Europe, blending Roman traditions with Germanic customs. Roads remained in use, Roman law influenced new codes, and Latin continued as the language of scholarship and the church. For centuries, historians would study the fall of Rome as a cautionary tale, a powerful civilization undone by a combination of internal weakness and external pressure. Yet, for us tonight, it is a story to listen to drift into a world long gone, and to find calm in its narration. So, as you lie back, letting these words guide you, imagine the last days of the Western Roman Empire, a civilization that ruled vast lands, faced insurmountable challenges, and ultimately transformed, leaving behind echoes of grandeur and lessons for eternity. Take a slow breath in and release it gently. Let your mind wander through Roman streets, aqueducts, and crumbling amphitheaters. Feel the history, the rise, the struggles, and finally, the quiet after centuries of turmoil. Remember, even the mightiest powers fade, but stories endure. And tonight, Rome's story has become part of your journey into rest. Good night, and may your dreams carry you softly through the corridors of time, across an empire that once was. Crescent Moon.